The Pokemon main series is in serious trouble, and everybody's hollering about it all across YouTube and social media. But is that really the case? Personally, I don't think so. In this video, I'm going to continue to explain why I think that is. Last time we left off with a preview of unpopular opinion number 3, which was the real problem is not Game Freak or anything else, it's unrealistic expectations. And of course, this is a very unpopular opinion, at least among the horde of Game Freak critics on the internet. I started part 1 by mentioning that some people would probably prove the very point that I was trying to make, and naturally that's exactly what happened. Also, if you haven't seen part 1 and want to start there for the full context, the link is in the description. I've already gotten several comments, either on the full video of part 1 or the shorts that I pulled from it, that point to exactly what I believe is the real problem. Internet hype, bandwagoning, and the tendency for negativity to drive much more engagement on social media than positivity, nuance, or thoughtful conversation. I recognize that and went into making this series fully understanding that in all likelihood I would get negative or even hateful comments. Frankly, I don't care. Like I've said to you guys already, I'm not interested in changing who I am or what I think just to fit a mold. Joining the angry mob that thinks Game Freak is lazier than your next door neighbor who never mows his yard because of his perpetual back problems would probably benefit this channel more than the opinions that I'm expressing here. I'm willing to live with that. What I'm not willing to do is be inauthentic. If that's not your vibe, the unsubscribe button is right down there.
Bye, Felicia.
But if you love Pokemon and want to hang out and talk about the series, even about things that you may disagree with, I'm glad you're here, and I really appreciate your support. So with that, let's keep going, starting with unpopular Pokemon opinion number 4, which is the Pokemon needs better graphics argument is the most overblown in the fandom. Yeah, this is a big one. The idea that Pokemon needs some kind of visual overhaul is probably the leading opinion of the Game Freak sucks crowd, and we touched on this some in part 1. I mentioned how Pokemon has never been an A-lister in terms of graphics and that it was never intended to be. It's like people have forgotten that Pokemon at its core and originally is a handheld game series. It started on a console that just barely has more processing power than an actual brick, the Game Boy. And then to the Game Boy Color, the Game Boy Advance, the DS, the 3DS, and now to the Switch. And here is where the trouble started, or at least that's what it seems like to me. I remember the first Pokemon games for the Switch, Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, receiving a lot of criticism not so much for their visuals, which I happen to think are absolutely beautiful, but for a change in gameplay that many viewed as watered down or overly streamlined. I actually agree with that to some extent. I would have much rather seen a full-blown Gen 1 remake, but I also understand the reasoning behind the simple mechanics that incorporated features that were previously exclusive to Pokemon Go. The Let's Go games were essentially introducing Pokemon to a new, younger generation of fans on a brand new console, many of whom had probably only played Pokemon Go on their mom's iPad while she tried to maintain her sanity in the McDonald's drive-thru line. And if they're anything like my kids, they probably douse that thing in sweet and sour sauce. Anyway, I understand the intent of Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, and it seems that most reviewers did too, with the games receiving mostly favorable marks. While if it was up to me, I would have gotten a lot more excited about Gen 1 remakes that use mechanics that all of us old-timers know and love, I totally get why they did what they did. And I still enjoyed the game, Let's Go Pikachu in my case, and I still play it from time to time. In other words, I feel like I understood the context. Knowing that people in my age demo aren't the only audience for these games, and that expecting something perfect from my perspective is totally unrealistic. And I think this is key to how we approach the rest of the series, especially Gens 8 and 9. Because this is where things started to get uglier than a Bruxish that had some kind of botched cosmetic surgery. Before Sword and Shield were even released, the gripe train was already screaming down the rails at full steam. And this was all because of, well, I probably don't even need to say it, yeah, you guessed it, the so-called Dexit controversy. Named after what came to be known as Brexit, or the UK's withdrawal from the European Union in 2020. You know what, I think I get it now. Dexit, Brexit, Galler's based on the UK. That's actually kind of clever. Anyway, if you didn't know, Dexit was the whole kerfluffle about Sword and Shield being the first games to not include a full national Pokedex. In other words, not every Pokemon that existed up until that point would be available in the games, whether by wild encounters, trading, or transferring from other games, or any other means. I'll be totally honest, when this was first announced, I was bothered by it. It seemed like a discontinuation of some kind of sacred tradition. It gave me this sense that my favorite series, these games that that have more or less defined my life. This franchise that I now recognize as an autistic special interest may never be the same again. I mean, what about my level 8 shiny Poochyena sitting in Pokemon Bank? You mean to tell me it's never going to experience the life-altering thrill of running free in Galar, bounding through the rolling Wooloo pastures, and taking in the wondrous smell of an alchemy that was left out in the sun too long? Yeah, looking back, it seems silly. And honestly, it was silly. With the new Pokemon introduced in Sword and Shield, the total number of Pokemon had risen to nearly 900. Now, I can see how including every single Pokemon in every single game moving forward could become unfeasible, affect game balance, and really not even be necessary. But at the time, it seemed like this huge crisis, maybe even bigger than the one that Chairman Rose caused with Eternatus. And in hindsight, I've realized that most of what riled me up was the riling up of so many other people online. Had I read that announcement and moved on, it might not have bothered me, or at least not as much. It was all the outrage really that made it so bad because it indicated to me that I too should be outraged. This is a well-documented dynamic in psychology, and I think it explains most of what's happening in our current cultural moment. One person's sense of offense validates the next. This sort of outrage chain, if you will, continues until it's all coalesced into this big, writhing wad of gripe that all shares the same opinion. To me, this is exactly what drives most of the criticism of the modern Pokemon games, particularly Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet, and now I guess Legend ZA. But what does this have to do with graphics? Well, I think the Let's Go games left people around my age that much hungrier for a full-bore mainline game on the Switch. And after the proverbial runaway grass fire that was Dexit had gotten out of control, people were left with the sense that their hopes had been dashed. They went into Sword and Shield with the expectation that these games must be half-baked, and as we saw, that's exactly what they saw. Or thought that they did, because confirmation bias is just that powerful. We as humans have an innate tendency to see what we want to see, to continuously reaffirm our own beliefs, either through others who share those beliefs, or through making connections or recognizing patterns where there really aren't any at all. The latter is actually what's called the frequency illusion. A good example of this is feeling like you see the same number everywhere, like a certain time of day. It could be 7-Eleven or whatever. You saw it once, made a mental note that made it stand out, and so you're more likely to see it again. And again. Before you know it, the same number is showing up on Burger King receipts, and you're convinced that either God or your long-deceased grandmother or the CIA is trying to send you some sort of secret message. Never mind all the other random numbers that you've seen and didn't really think much about. But this is a real psychological phenomenon, and I think it explains a lot of the torches and pitchforks that were brought out against Sword and Shield. Because before you knew it, people were harping on things like trees. Yeah, like for real. For whatever reason, the rendering of the trees in these games became this huge pain point that was widely discussed online. I mean, are they the best looking trees? No, but it's a tree. I'm not playing these games for the trees. Yet, the digital dog pile continued. Yeah, these games are fun and all, let me tell you, but those trees! To me, this is a prime example of how a beloved game series that's never been graphically groundbreaking and was never expected to be, suddenly became the whipping boy for a legion of armchair coding critics with standards even tighter than their ill-fitting undergarments. Maybe I'm just totally naive, but I don't feel quite at liberty to criticize the jobs that other people do that I can't do myself, and I have zero experience in game development. I just play them, and believe me, the last thing that I'm judging a game by is how the freaking trees look. I mean, give me a break. Anyway, a lot of those said trees were in Sword and Shield's wild area, which was really the series' first kind of experiment with an open world format. A more expansive space to catch unique kinds of Pokemon isn't anything new, with the Safari Zone being a thing since Red and Blue. But the free-roaming player-controlled camera, which was only a thing in the wild area, was a series first. And that brings us to our next unpopular opinion, and boy is it a spicy one. Number 5, Pokemon was never meant to have an open world format. Yep, you heard me right. What's that look for? I told you these were unpopular opinions. Come on, it's in the title, dude. But yeah, personally, I think going open world was a bad move at worst and unnecessary at best. Maybe it's just because I'm a bit of a purist with a fierce loyalty to old school Pokemon, but I don't think open world and Pokemon fit very well. I fully understand that exploration is a major concept and selling point of the series, but that doesn't mean there aren't other ways to achieve that than an open 3D environment. And this gets back to Pokemon being a handheld series. To this day, I still don't think of Pokemon as a home console video game series. Because it's not. I actually very seldom even play on a TV, because it just feels weird, you know? Pokemon was fundamentally built for portability and always has been. I've talked about this before, but the ability to take your Pokemon collection anywhere, explore this digital world from anywhere in the real world, and trade or battle with your friends anytime, anywhere, is a huge part of what made Pokemon so successful in the first place. It's why I went from being so skeptical of Pokemon Go to almost viewing it as the spiritual successor of the Game Boy era. For me, it kind of brings back that getting together to play with your buddies on the playground aspect. Hence the title of Pokémon, Pocket Monsters. Or as my granny used to say, Pokemon. You can put them in your pocket and play while your mom's getting that 2-hour haircut. Or even worse, shopping for clothes at the J.C. Penney's. I don't know if any of you have had this thought, but I think this helps explain why all the trouble started when Pokemon switched to the Switch. Obviously, Nintendo's latest system is named for its dual role as both a handheld and home console. Because of that, games have to pull double duty and translate well to both formats in terms of gameplay, visuals, and performance. That's a tricky balance because you're talking drastically different sized screens and actual processing power. When the Switch or Switch 2 are docked, they pull more power to run its hardware, namely the processor, at full speed. When in handheld, that speed is clocked down to preserve battery life. Otherwise, you'd run out of juice faster than a powerlifter trying to run a marathon in South Texas in the middle of July. So with Pokemon, you've got a series that's always been handheld suddenly being expected to perform as well as other more established home console titles. And as we saw with Scarlet and Violet, or at least their Switch 1 versions, that just didn't happen. Did you say something negative about Pokemon? Yeah. Believe it or not, I fully acknowledge that Gen 9 had performance issues that really impacted the gameplay, especially in certain areas of Paldea's map. And I imagine this was mostly because Game Freak, again a relatively small studio, was expected to go from a fixed camera linear format to a free roaming camera open world format in a matter of one generation. Instead of being all in on one format, which was always handheld historically, they ended up having to sort of ride the fence, with the performance being just okay. I can't prove this, but my concern is that Game Freak felt pressured enough by the Get With The Times crowd to go open world, and tried to do too much too quickly, which resulted in their attempt to accommodate only bringing more criticism. And of course, people were going to use Breath of the Wild as their standard of comparison, which made things that much worse. With that said, I still loved the games and got more of that childhood magical feeling when playing Scarlet for the first time than I did even with Sword, while acknowledging its downsides. Hopefully, Winds and Waves will perfect the series' entry into the open world format, and early previews are definitely pointing in that direction. But even still, I just can't shake this feeling that Pokemon was more forced into it than it being a natural progression of its inherent concept. Before we wrap up, I want to share a comment from Pebbleshy, which I think perfectly captures how I feel about this subject. Here's what they said. My issue with many of the things some people say Game Freak should do is that they state it as if it is objectively the most desirable, and it's not. Pokemon does not need to be open world. In fact, I never really wanted it to be. I'm okay with it being where they've gone now, but it did not make it better, it just made it different. Also, a linear story does not mean bad. In fact, a linear story is often better. Less freedom on where to go, sure, but again, that does not make a game worse just because of that. I don't want too much realism in my Pokemon games. That includes the environment. I want stylish art. If I want realistic environments and creatures, I go outside. So I like story. I like to know where to go and what I need to do. Give me a clear goal. I don't want to be thrown into a world with nothing to go off of and be told just do whatever. I was hesitant to get Breath of the Wild for that reason. Turned out it had enough of a goal and story to go from, but I wouldn't want less than that. And give me colorful, stylized art. Give me whimsy and comfort. There's plenty of dark and gritty in the world as it is. Amen to that. So yeah, many of the flaws, quote unquote, that some people want fixing, quote unquote, isn't even actual flaws, it's just different preferences, which is fine. No one is wrong for wanting more realistic Pokemon games, open world, or all that. But don't think it's what everyone wants, and don't think that Game Freak should cater more to your wants on that matter than what others might want. And yes, that goes both ways and includes myself. This is absolutely spot on, because it not only speaks to the whole open world thing, but also the core issue that the perceived need for an open world stems from. And that's the idea that there's a particular format or style of game that makes it objectively better than another. Open world games games are currently very popular, but I don't think that makes them the new standard for what makes a game good. Ultimately, it comes down to opinion, or subjective preference. And in my opinion, Pokemon in a sense has become a victim of its own success, being expected to do things that it simply can't at this moment in time by people who seem to have forgotten what made it successful in the first place. Not sophistication or performance, but fun. Being excited by discovering new things, developing new strategies, or completing a difficult challenge. Having fun with your friends who are doing the same thing right along with you. To me, that's what it's all about and can continue to be all about if only people would chill the heck out a little bit. Anyway, that's probably enough for this one. If you agreed with everything I said in this video, be sure to let me know to gratify my fragile ego. Just kidding, that was a joke. Again, that's not what I'm after, and I hope that even if you see things differently, that you enjoyed this chat from a fellow Pokemon nerd. If you did and you want to support the channel, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up and a subscribe and a hype and a whatever else, all the YouTubey stuff as we continue building this community. And be sure to stick around for part 3 coming soon. Until then, thanks again guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Pokemon!